So thank you all for joining. I am Stacey Kasianchuk, Gennev's Director of Health Coaching. I'm a registered dietitian and exercise physiologist, and we are joined here with Dr. Wendy Ellis, one of our naturopathic physicians. And Wendy, can you introduce yourself to the group and tell everyone a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. As Stacey mentioned, my name is Wendy Ellis, and I'm a naturopathic doctor here in Seattle. And I've been predominantly doing a hormone-related type practice since 2005, and adrenal dysfunction comes up a lot. And so what I really love about it is that it's not just a quick fix. It's something that involves a lot of self-care, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I'm really looking forward to having an honest conversation about the adrenals and how they serve us and how they sometimes don't serve us.
Excellent. I'm excited for this topic as well. Working with my clients through Gennev, this has come up several times, clients asking about adaptogens specifically. What are they? How can they use them? And what the purpose of it is. And in talking with Wendy and her knowledge and information, we really realized we have to take a step back here and help people understand more about what adaptogens are, what they're targeting, and looking at stress in general. And this time right now that we're facing between pandemics and looking at the country in terms of our problems and challenges with racism coming to a pinnacle point here. There's a lot of stress out there, and then you add menopause in it, and that can be a lot for a lot of women.
We've all had to become teachers.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, right. Homeschooling, working from home, you name it. There's plenty of stress to be had.
Yeah.
So let's jump right in and start with just some basic information. And can you describe for our participants, Wendy, in terms of what are the adrenal glands and what is their role in the body? Why do we have them?
Adrenal glands, they're like teeny pyramid-shaped glands that sit on top of our kidneys. And even though they're not directly related to kidney function, they do have a role in sodium, potassium, and our blood pressure. The adrenal glands are mainly to respond to stress, and that can be any sort of stress. That could be physiologic stress. That could be, stress from all the things that Stacey just mentioned. And so the adrenal glands produce predominantly two hormones. They produce cortisol and DHEA. And cortisol and DHEA cortisol is our stress response. And most people, when they think about cortisol, they think about that's a bad thing, but it's necessary for life. And when it comes to cortisol, it works in a diurnal rhythm, meaning it's highest in the morning and then it declines over the day, because we need cortisol for energy and for living. And so if it peaks usually around 5 to 7 in the morning, and then it should decline over the day, because if we have too high cortisol levels at nighttime, it makes it really hard to sleep. And then DHEA is the other most important hormone produced by the adrenal glands. And DHEA actually it's in its highest peak before we're born. And then it sort of peaks at the age, and then it sort of declines at birth. And then at the age of 25, it makes a slow decline. So we think about cortisol and DHEA as having an inverse relationship, meaning that as we age, cortisol tends to rise, and then DHEA tends to fall. Our adrenal glands if we think about adrenal dysfunction, there's two major health conditions that are Cushing's disease, which is where your body produces way too much cortisol, and how that presents clinically is generally a really puffy face. We think about truncal obesity, like a barrel-shaped body. And this is a medical condition that needs to be treated. We can have Cushingoid syndrome associated with people who have chronically high cortisol levels. And then Addison's disease is basically the opposite, where your body's not able to produce cortisol. And this is a life-threatening, you can't live without cortisol. And so patients who have Addison's disease are actually on 100% cortisol hormone replacement, generally from 20 to 40 milligrams per day, depending on the amount of exercise or stress or activity they have, or whether it's a male or a female. Male bodies tend to have more cortisol than female bodies because of body mass index. Um, and so the adrenals, they work to not only help us respond to stress, but also they're an anti-inflammatory. And so cortisol is really essential to life. And so having healthy adrenal function is really critical to so many components of our health, including blood sugar regulation as well. So, and immune function.
Yeah, a lot of work that those little glands do on a regular basis, and so important for health and physiological function. And it sounds like there's extremes where there can be, true medical conditions where there needs to be treatment, like you mentioned, the Cushing's disease and Addison's disease. And then there's existence in between. I hear clients asking and mentioning this term adrenal fatigue. You use adrenal dysfunction. Can you distinguish between the two, or give an explanation of what these are and maybe dispel any misconceptions?
Yes, I know it's interesting because as a naturopathic doctor, adrenal dysfunction or adrenal fatigue is something that is a term that's used for me a little too loosely. I think that, when it comes to adrenal dysfunction, generally what this means is that either the cortisol is way too high, and so you're getting the negative effects of having too much cortisol, which we can discuss,
Mm-hmm.
or you have an altered circadian rhythm of your cortisol. And so there are certain tests that you can do to check adrenal function. And as a naturopath, sort of the test that's used most frequently is really a cortisol salivary test,
Mm-hmm.
where you actually can check your cortisol, and it's really you just spit in a tube 4 times throughout the day, starting at like 7 in the morning and finishing at like, midnight. And what you're assessing is to see if you have a healthy cortisol rhythm, meaning is it high in the morning and is it declining over the day?
Mm.
And so when we think about adrenal dysfunction, we're thinking not only how much cortisol are you producing, but do you have that natural cortisol rhythm where you have high cortisol in the morning and then it's declining at night so you can go to sleep? I think adrenal fatigue is a little bit of a misnomer. I don't really like to use that term because beyond Addison's disease, adrenals are always going to make cortisol. If you can't make cortisol, like I said earlier, it's not compatible with living. But I do think that in our current society, we are on this sort of burning the candle at both ends. And so I think a lot of people who really find themselves sort of saying, yes, I definitely feel adrenal fatigue, it generally means that they're just tired, they're burnt out, they have low blood pressure, they just lose that vitality.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not as common as the other condition, which is too much cortisol. And I would say that too much cortisol is a chronic problem across the board with our society. And we see high cortisol associated with diabetes, heart disease. We see it correlated with, just obesity. And so there's a whole spectrum of adrenal dysfunction. So you could feel like you had low cortisol levels, and then you could also have high cortisol levels.
And that's a great point. Again, coming back to that spectrum, so important to recognize that individuals may exist on different areas of that spectrum and perhaps different areas during their life. One thing you mentioned is that there are times cortisol is necessary to live. Sometimes when talking with clients, they've wanted to get their cortisol as low as possible. They think low cortisol is optimal because there's this maybe misconception that cortisol is bad. Can you talk a little bit more about when cortisol can be detrimental, or when it may be more harmful, or when it's too high or too high too long?
Yes. So there's this sort of, instead of thinking about cortisol and DHEA as having an inverse relationship, cortisol and insulin are correlated together. Mm-hmm. Meaning that generally speaking, when you have high cortisol, you tend to have high insulin as well. So if we go back to, sort of hunter-gatherer ages, when, let's say you haven't eaten and you're, really hungry and your body's pumping out, cortisol because you're stressed, basically you start running after that buffalo or whatever, and then, you know, your cortisol goes up to help you respond to stress.
Mhm.
But in this day and age, we're living in this chronic stress, and we're eating a lot of processed food, a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of sugar, a lot of food that's actually not really food. And so when that insulin rises, secondary to eating all that processed food, because it's kind of a biochemistry lesson. So when we eat, let's say I eat a piece of bread, and I, you know, eat a piece of bread and I put jam on it. My blood sugar is going to rise, and then my insulin is going to rise to help get that blood sugar into the cell. But when that insulin rises, your cortisol generally rises too. And so a chronic diet of having too much processed food and food that doesn't have a lot of nutritive value, that has very little fiber or very little, you know, complex carbohydrates like beans or proteins, those diets tend to really raise that insulin level, which raises the cortisol level. And so your body is basically suffering the effects of that high cortisol. And we tend to put that weight on around the middle. So it's like that Cushingoid syndrome, where that chronic stress gives us high cortisol throughout the entire day. And so you're not getting this natural cortisol rhythm. You're basically having cortisol that sort of sits like this. Obviously, it goes down a little bit at nighttime, but when it comes to being able to sleep, if you have those high cortisol levels secondary to your lifestyle habits during the day, then what happens is that you just have the sustained problems of having too much cortisol, which is really diabetes, heart disease. It basically, as instead of cortisol being an anti-inflammatory, which it should be as on a daily basis, it becomes pro-inflammatory.
Okay.
And so I think that as a population, we tend to have this high cortisol fraction instead of low cortisol. And so it just creates breakdown of our bodies and breakdown of tissues instead of being, you know, helpful and anti-inflammatory.
Yeah, so it's the rhythmic the rhythmic effect of cortisol, or that high in the morning and then decreasing throughout the day is beneficial. But when it's chronically high, that's when we can see some of these detrimental effects.
Exactly, exactly. And so when people come in and they talk about the fact that they can't sleep, cortisol is definitely one of the things that we address. And
Okay.
as I mentioned, you can do those 4-point salivary cortisol tests,
Hmm.
traditionally to check for actual adrenal fatigue or, you know, Addison's disease. It's a clinical test that you do where you inject the precursor, which is ACTH, which is a pituitary hormone. So you inject that in an IV. Before that time, you do a 24-hour urine collection for cortisol, and then they inject that ACTH, and then they do a urine test after to see if your body's actually able to produce cortisol secondary to giving the stimulant to
Okay.
that. So when we think about adrenal testing, salivary testing is something that actually even LabCorp is doing now. And so I think that, you know, people are asking for it.
Mm-hmm.
There is a blood test for cortisol, but there have actually been clinical studies that a lot of people don't like having their blood drawn, or they feel very
Right.
stressed. And so the test is not that great because, you know, the cortisol can rise just in response to thinking about the fact that you're having a blood draw.
Really good point.
Yes.
Well, with the, you mentioned the diet can definitely play a role in keeping those, as being a stressor in keeping the elevated cortisol. What are some other lifestyle things that that can impact cortisol, elevate those levels that we may be exposed to on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, you know, we live in this go, go, go 20th century, and the stress of go, go, going definitely increases that. And then exercise. So it's interesting because exercise, we need cortisol to exercise.
Hmm.
And when you're acutely exercising, so let's say I'm going to go for a run, my cortisol will actually rise in response to that active exercise. And so you have a bump in cortisol, but that exercise and that bump in cortisol and that regular exercise actually gives you a lower baseline cortisol throughout the course of your lifetime. So if you want to actually improve your cortisol levels and not have high cortisol levels, You have to eat a clean diet that's not full of refined carbohydrates. You have to exercise regularly so you have like lower cortisol levels over the course of time. And then you also need to have a daily regimen that correlates with your cortisol rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
And as we live in this time in life where, you know, a lot of us are living in cities and, you know, we have all this sort of light pollution that comes in, the light dark rhythm is something that really plays a role in our cortisol levels. And so if we are staying up late in front of our computers, if we're eating really late at nighttime, even if it's seemingly healthy food, all of those things are going to negatively impact your cortisol in the evening. And so when we talk about how to lower your cortisol levels, you want to eat earlier in the day. You want to exercise earlier in the day. You want to have some period of time when you get home after work and you need to sort of ramp down and bring that stress level down. So that could be stretching, that could be walking, that could be reading or knitting. But it's really important at the end of a stressful day to do something that's going to bring more harmony and more relaxation so your cortisol levels can therefore, you know, respond to that.
Yeah, such a great point of that, just having that rhythm in our day and versus that elevation. And I think we've all experienced where we notice when we are at a high level of stress for an extended period of time and it starts to wear on us. Some of us may notice that's when our immune system gets depressed. So many times I've gotten sick once I've had an extended period of stress, and then there's that letdown, and all of a sudden you get a cold or you get the flu. And at a time right now, no one wants to get sick. So it's important to figure out how we can manage stress.
Exactly.
Well, let's talk about where adaptogens play a role here and how they fit in. And we're going to come back to some of the lifestyle things because based on what you said, it doesn't sound like adaptogens are going to be the answer, but certainly they're out there. So let's talk about what they are first and how do they play a role in supporting the body's stress response?
Yeah, and adaptogens, it's, you know, it's a tricky one because there's a lot of definitions for adaptogens. And actually, in preparation for this, I actually pulled up a pretty good definition of adaptogens, and I'm just going to read it to you. Um, Basically said it was, they were initially defined as substances that enhance the state of non-specific resistance to stress. Um, and this stress is linked with various disorders that involve not only our endocrine system, but in the way we think and process information, and also in our immunity. And so when we think about adaptogens, we're thinking about things that are supporting our, you know, our cognitive function, our physical function as far as how we can respond to stress, how we can, you know, go out and exercise, but also how we sustain a healthy immune system, which of course, in this state of COVID where we have this virus that we really don't have anything to protect ourselves against, having a strong immune system and doing everything we can to support our immune system, which means managing your stress appropriately, is really important. And adaptogens are, it's interesting because when we think of adaptogens, it's two different ways. It's basically a substance that's given to you that is meant to help you in the way that your body needs it the most, which sounds like a little, you know, it sounds a little foo-foo, but at the same time, you know, I when I was doing a lot of research into the various herbs and nutrients that are considered adaptogens, which, you know, we'll mention the ones that are most common. So ashwagandha is probably the most common adaptogen.
Okay.
Rhodiola is an adaptogen. Cordyceps, which is a type of mushroom, is considered an adaptogen. Maca is even considered an adaptogen. And those are, you know, they all can be used to support the immune system, but they all can be used to support stress. And there's actually even clinical studies in rats that were fed a high-fat diet, that when they were given adaptogens that actually improved their protection against obesity. And so it's really interesting because adaptogens, you know, and most herbs actually, if we think about herbs, I think a lot of issues happen when we talk about herbs, because there's not a lot of money to be made in herbs, and you can't patent a natural substance. And so unfortunately, there's not a lot of great clinical studies on herbs, but with the demand, there are more and more clinical studies, and the ones mentioned actually have pretty great safety profiles. And that being said, we want to make sure that we're using a supplement that's from a reputable company. And so it's really important. Like if I bought an herb from China, I don't know if that's contaminated with lead or pesticides. And so when you do buy these products, it's important that you take a look at that and whether it's from a reputable company. But adaptogens are meant to support you in the way that your body needs the most. It's kind of a simplified answer, but that's the definition. So if I need more immune support, it's supposed to be helping my immune system. If I have high stress, it's supposed to help high cortisol. And if I actually feel like I have low adrenal function and I have reduced cortisol response, or I have it's supposed to help both high and low cortisol. So adaptogen just basically means that it's supposed to help you in the way that your body needs it the most.
Sounds like the title of it basically adapts to what you need as an adaptogen. Oh, interesting. That's fascinating. And glad to hear that there are some more research going into these herbs that are out there, and the few that you mentioned that are safe, and as long as you're getting them from a reputable source. When we think about menopause, so that's an additional stress on the body, a natural stress that comes during this time of life. How does that connect to, let's talk about just how that impacts the body's stress response first. How does that impact that?
There's actually, I actually found quite a few clinical studies that looked at cortisol response in menopause. And for those of you who don't know, menopause is really associated with an increased weight around the middle. And that, when I see a patient and they're carrying a lot of weight around the middle, I automatically think about cortisol, because generally those people have a higher cortisol value. And so when we approach menopause, actually, as our bodies create that fat around the middle that make more estrone, which is a really potent estrogen. And yesterday we were talking about it's protective, because our bodies want to put more fat around the middle so that fat can produce estrogen as we go through menopause. But as that estrone is produced, it actually creates more cortisol. And the more cortisol you produce, unfortunately, it's going to propagate that weight around the middle. And not only does cortisol increase weight around the middle, it also increases hot flashes. And so menopause being a stress is generally associated with higher cortisol production, which also just makes hot flashes worse.
Okay, so there's a little bit of a cycle here, I'm hearing.
Certainly, yes.
And what about with these adaptogens? Can they be effective during menopause, or is there research on this in this population, or what do you see?
There actually is. And ashwagandha is probably the one that has the most research. And I would say that ashwagandha can be helpful for a number of things. So there are studies showing that ashwagandha can really help with sleep. And so people who have sleep latency, meaning they have a hard time getting to sleep, ashwagandha can actually help lower that cortisol in the evening and help them sleep. And then the other thing that a lot of women complain about around perimenopause and, in that menopausal transition to postmenopause is that brain fog, where they start sort of missing words and searching for words. And, in perimenopause myself, I'm experiencing that, where you're like, I see that thing, I know what it is, I can describe it, but you're just grasping for that word. And actually, ashwagandha has been shown to actually improve brain plasticity and cognitive function around menopause. And so brain plasticity, just to describe that, it seems backwards. I think of plastic as being hard, but plasticity in the brain means that information can travel like rapidly and freely between the different components of our cognitive function. And so ashwagandha has been really shown to help with cognitive function and being able to think more fluidly and clearly at menopause.
Oh wow, that's great to hear that there's some benefits there. And with some of these, with ashwagandha specifically, would this be something that would be anyone should take this, or does it depend on the individual, or does the response depend on the individual?
You know, both men and women can take ashwagandha. It's not just for menopause, and it's not just for people with low cortisol or high cortisol, because it can actually help. There are clinical studies that show that it actually improves perceived stress.
Mm,
And so if I feel like I can take ashwagandha and be able to handle my stress better, then that stress is going to be, not having all those sort of cumulative downstream effects.
mhm.
And so ashwagandha, sorry about that, working in my office today.
Yes. You're live from your
I'm,
office.
I'm
Yes.
live, and that's the front door.
Yeah.
Um, so ashwagandha can be taken for people who are just fatigued because they're not sleeping, but
Mhm.
also those people who do have high cortisol at nighttime who need help, you know, getting to sleep. But it could also be taken in the morning and not make you sleepy, but improve your ability to respond to stress when you have to get up after a night of not sleeping and you need to go to work and respond to all the stressors that
Mhm.
don't take a break with menopause. They just seem to accumulate at menopause, because I feel like, generally when women hit menopause, we're also in this sort of peak in our careers, right, where everything is really busy and the stress is pretty high. And if anything, you need more support to help you get through that stress, secondary to the place you are in your life, but also with menopause just adding an additional stress.
Yes. I have several clients too that have adolescent children right now while they're in perimenopause, and they talk about actually feeling the hormonal mix that's happening in their house at that time when you have a child that has changing hormones and then your hormones are changing. There's a cumulative effect.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. I'm having that. I think the kids in my house are creating a little more cortisol production for me.
There you go.
I love them, but they're ever present.
Yes. Well, we got a question around what is the best way to take ashwagandha?
It depends. So favorite, one of my favorite ashwagandhas out there is called Cortisol Manager, and I'm not at all correlated with this company, Integrative Therapeutics, but Cortisol Manager has a number of different ingredients in it, including ashwagandha. And if people take that, I generally have them taken at night, because for the most part, most people do have high cortisol, and so more often than low cortisol, we're trying to treat the effects of high cortisol, especially in this specific group of peri and postmenopause. And so most adaptogens are generally taken at nighttime, but they can be helpful in the morning as well.
Okay, good to. And is that in a capsule form then?
It is in a capsule form. And actually, I did pull up some pretty typical doses
Hmm.
for ashwagandha. And it's about, like, let's see, it's funny just to see my own writing. It's about 500 milligrams. So I'd
Okay.
say for most adaptogens, it's 400 to 500 milligrams of the dried herb.
Hmm. All right. Well, you mentioned some other ones. Rhodiola, I think, was another one. What does that one help with?
Yeah, actually the same thing.
Okay.
So rhodiola has been shown specifically to support not only the immune system, but
Mm,
also to help reduce cortisol levels and actually to improve your response to stress.
okay.
So, and the other one that is a pretty common adaptogen is actually ginseng. And there's lots
Oh,
of different
interesting.
ginsengs. But that one we tend to take earlier in the morning, because that one does tend to be pretty stimulating.
Hmm.
But I'd say rhodiola and ashwagandha are more typically taken in the evening, because they do tend to be more for people who do have that high evening cortisol.
Okay. And would there be a reason that you would prescribe one versus the other for someone?
I would say that ashwagandha probably has more history and more research than rhodiola. And so I tend to start with ashwagandha just because I've had better clinical success with that one. But at the
Okay.
same time, oftentimes when it comes to adrenal supplements, they kind of throw everything in together.
Hmm.
And so I know we're talking about herbs right now, but there are certain nutrients that are really important in adrenal function. And one of them is actually vitamin C. And if you actually took an adrenal gland and sort of broke it open, you would see higher concentrations of vitamin C, B vitamins, specifically B6 and B5, and those are important in cortisol production. And also boron. Boron is a nutrient that's also important in bone density and immune system, but boron's important in adrenal function as well. And so, I think one of the most important things is that when people are feeling stressed and are having mood disturbances, we generally add B vitamins in there because they're important in adrenal function. And so those tend to be taken earlier in the morning because B vitamins can be very stimulating and you want to eat them with food. And so generally, we're trying to discourage late night eating
Hmm.
because we don't want that rise in cortisol. And so adrenal supplements that have B vitamins in them are better taken earlier in the morning. And herbs, adrenal sort of herbs, tend to be taken in the evening.
Okay. And we have a question here. If a patient has a history of CVA, is it safe to take any of these adaptogens?
Did you say CV,
CVA, cardio,
cardiovascular?
CVA. Maybe I can ask. Stroke.
Oh, um, without looking at that, without specifically looking for that, I can't say 100%.
Hmm.
However, if we think about I don't think about those herbs having any potential for increased clotting.
Hmm. Okay.
So they should be fine.
Okay. Maybe something that's still check with your physician if you are thinking about it, but
Yeah, and
lower
it's
on the risk
also,
scale.
yeah, and the other thing is with any herb, there's a lot of herb drug interactions.
Mm.
And so it's really important to note that if you do start some sort of herbal treatment, that you check with your physician to make sure that there's no interactions because some of them can actually decrease the actions of medications, but some
Hmm.
can potentiate the action. So it can make it more potent. So
Okay.
we certainly don't want to affect someone's drug regimen with an herb.
Okay. Any other things that people should be aware of as potential risks or dosing, reasons to stay definitely in that 400 to 500 milligram?
When we look at safety studies, if we think about maca, we haven't talked about maca yet. But maca, ashwagandha, rhodiola, they generally have pretty good safety studies. And if we look at toxicity studies, we're talking about 20 and 30 times the amount of that specific
Okay.
herb. And so it's really, I would say for the most part, they're pretty safe herbs when taken in that 400 to 500 milligram dose.
Okay.
One thing we haven't touched on, which I think is really important, is DHEA.
Mm. All
Um,
right. So let's
so if
dive
we Yeah, let's talk about DHEA because it's a really hot topic
in.
and it's available over the counter unless you're in Canada, and then it's not available over the counter. But DHEA is in the same family as testosterone. It's an androgen. So if you think about cortisol as too much cortisol is breaking tissues down, so it has sort of a catabolic state. DHEA is an anabolic steroid. So all hormones are steroids. Estrogens, progesterone, testosterone, DHEA. And DHEA is one of these things that has amazing potential, but it can metabolize to testosterone, to estrogen, to progesterone. And most DHEA supplements come in 25 milligram capsules. And when you swallow that capsule, you have no idea what your body is going to do with that. So,
Mm.
in the case of someone who carries a lot of weight around the middle, that DHEA tends to aromatize to estrogen. So if you have a man that's taking DHEA thinking, I'm going to improve my testosterone. If you carry all this extra weight around the middle, it's going to go straight to estrogen.
Oh,
If
interesting.
you, yeah, and then when it comes to women, if I have, there's something called the 5-alpha reductase enzyme,
Hmm.
which is basically the enzyme that converts testosterone to dihydrotestosterone. And I like to think about, so if you think about guys that are like super hairy bodies and they have bald heads, they have a lot of that enzyme. So they have a lot of the most active testosterone. Women who tend to be athletic, lean, sort of women who build muscle mass pretty easily, when they take DHEA, it's less likely to go to estrogen, but it's heavily likely to go to testosterone.
Mm.
And when that happens, you can create hair loss, you can get acne, you can have increased body hair, and we don't want too much testosterone. You know,
Right.
you want a healthy ratio between estrogen and testosterone. So DHEA, also because it's over the counter, it's not regulated by the FDA.
Mm.
And the FDA actually did a study that I read about years ago where they took 25 different DHEAs off the counter and then they measured their DHEA, and something like 75% of them didn't have the DHEA dose that was mentioned on the label. Some had 0%, and one of them had like 1,000% of the DHEA that was mentioned.
Wow.
So DHEA is one of these things that seems harmless, but because you just don't know how it's metabolized, and if I had breast cancer and it was a hormone sensitive breast cancer and I went and grabbed some DHEA and I took it because I was tired, that could have negative impacts on that. So
Mm.
it's one of those things that you should definitely talk to your doctor about before
Yeah.
taking it.
And still highlights the challenges with so many supplements out there and the lack of regulation and importance of choosing supplements that are or not regulated, but verified through third-party verification, or the practitioner that is providing it knows more about it for you.
Yeah, and on the Gennev blog, we do have a blog about how to
Hmm.
determine if something is a good supplement. So
Excellent.
search that up.
Yeah, good reminder to check out that learning library, and just with a pretty robust search engine. So just put in supplements and it should pop up, and we can also include that in a link and in the follow-up to this webinar. Well, let's talk about maca, because that's another one that has come up, and especially with women in menopause, there are some claims that can help with hot flashes. I have some clients that swear by it, some clients that say it tastes awful and they're not noticing a difference, but they'll do anything to feel better right now.
Yes, and maca is one of those herbs that I found it's either going to work or it's not.
Hmm.
And when maca is taken, it has been shown to help with hot flashes. But I'd say that more women I have found take maca because it just makes them feel more level headed.
Mm.
And in this perimenopause, menopausal transition, or postmenopause, I feel like moods are more difficult to manage. And so anything that can help women feel more, sort of level headed,
Hmm.
um, can be really helpful. And the maca, I'd say 500 milligrams is usually the amount that it comes in, but generally women take somewhere between 500 and 1,000 milligrams of maca. And again, it's considered an adaptogen. And so if you feel like you have adrenals that just don't respond to stress as well, maca can help that. But if you're also one of these women who have really high cortisol, it can help with that as well. It can help
Mm.
offset those issues with thinking and those issues with stress response, and it can help hot flashes. And so it's one of those herbs that has a lot of benefit in many different ways.
Okay, multi-purpose it sounds like, and adapting to what the individual may need.
Exactly, exactly.
And with maca, this might play into even what you mentioned around other forms of the ashwagandha and rhodiola. Are there, if I've seen it in powder form and to include in, say, smoothies or oatmeal, something like that. And then I've also seen it in capsules. Does it matter the delivery mechanism?
Well, what you're going to get in the capsule is generally just a powder anyway.
Okay.
And so it's less on the delivery and more on the total milligram dosage.
Okay. point.
And there are, just like ginseng, there's different types of maca as well.
Hmm.
I'd say there's probably more research in the feminescence is
Hmm.
probably the maca that is most known in the clinical world.
Okay.
And that is a 500 milligram capsule taken, one capsule twice a day generally.
Okay. And how about the cordyceps? You mentioned those as in the mushroom family. What are those used for? Is that similar in terms of the stress response?
Yeah, it's interesting. It was interesting for me to read about cordyceps being an adaptogen sort of thrown in the same category because when
Hmm.
I think of cordyceps, I think more about cordyceps and its immune enhancing properties.
Mm.
And so when I use cordyceps or, reishi mushrooms, I generally use them for people who just have poor immune tolerance,
Hmm.
and they just feel like they are getting sick more easily. And so the rhodiola, ashwagandha, maca tend to be the more like clinical symptoms that you feel as far as, stress or memory or hot flashes or mood. Whereas the cordyceps I don't tend to use those for that so much as I use them for people who just feel like their resilience is down and they're
Hmm.
like, I get sick all the time, or I go through stress. And like you mentioned, you go through a big stress and immediately when it's over, that
Hmm.
you tend to get sick. And so I tend to use more of the mushrooms when I'm thinking about trying to improve the overall immune response.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah, it seems like there's still a stress connection. We know immune function can be connected to the stress, and we know the whole body is connected, but that there might be some nuances in each of these that might be used for different things depending on the individual.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly, exactly. But again, mushrooms are a really safe thing to take.
Hmm.
Again, you don't want to take too much of them.
Hmm.
Um, but for the cordyceps, I'd say there's plenty of research on cordyceps being safe for you to take, assuming you get them from a reputable company.
Yes, so kind of keep putting that out there. And how about in terms of, thinking about food? What about cooking with mushrooms, and do you get the same benefits in that way?
I would say yes, but you probably, when you're thinking about cordyceps or you're thinking about an extract,
Hmm.
you're probably going to have to eat a lot more than you would, as far as to equal what's in a capsule form.
Okay.
Because it's generally dried and pulverized versus when we eat mushrooms, we tend to eat the fresh mushrooms.
Right.
And so that's a lot of mushrooms. But
Yeah.
the longer I'm in practice, the more I am getting away from supplements and
Hmm.
really focusing on the lifestyle.
Yeah.
Because you can't supplement your way out of an unhealthy lifestyle. I feel like that's going to be the tagline on my. I'm not going to have gravestone, but if I did,
Yeah.
it would
Maybe a license plate somehow.
Yeah, exactly. But I do feel like, I feel like we've missed the mark when it comes to adrenal dysfunction, that it's not that our adrenals are just, with thyroid, for example, it's not like our thyroids wear out and then we're going to have to take thyroid hormone replacement. Generally it's an autoimmune thing, or there's many reasons for thyroid, but when your thyroid is low you take thyroid hormone replacement. When your adrenals are low you generally don't take cortisol. I mean, there
Hmm.
are some circumstances where women have really low blood pressures and they have really low cortisol levels when you're checking even in the blood, and sometimes those women, they get sick really easily, and so it's very controversial, but sometimes taking a small amount of cortisol can be really helpful.
Hmm.
But I'd say that's an extremely rare event when that occurs. But I would say that adrenal dysfunction generally happens because we're doing too much and we're not taking care of ourselves. And
Hmm.
so when it comes to adrenal fatigue, it generally means that our self care is lacking and we're not sleeping enough and we're not eating the proper food to fuel our bodies effectively. And we are not finding a way to manage our stress. and we're staying up too late, or we're over exercising. There are so many things. And so when it really comes down to improving adrenal function, B vitamins, vitamin C, ashwagandha, those things can help you feel better. But unless you go back and you really take a hard look at, what am I doing in my life that's putting me in this exhaustive state?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, at the end of the day, adrenal fatigue isn't an adrenal function, it's a lifestyle issue.
Yeah.
And so it's not like I don't believe in adrenal fatigue. I do believe our adrenals take a hit
Mm-hmm.
from not taking care of ourselves. And yeah, so I think that's where the controversy lies.
Yeah, and I think that brings just such a great reminder that it is this holistic approach, and that yes, there are these options out here. Their adaptogens are more popular, they're getting more attention, but it's not, we still have to come back to it's not a quick fix. And many of these things do lie in where the stress is coming from. So it's getting to the root of it. And perhaps the adaptogens may be appropriate to provide additional support, but if you don't address the cause, it's not going to really get you to where the optimal state might be.
Exactly. And, as we talked about before, cortisol does rise over time, and we
Mm-hmm.
can't stop menopause from happening.
Mm-hmm.
It happens to everybody. And so if we know that cortisol does rise in response to stress, and it does rise in response to time, like there's nothing lifestyle wise you can do about menopause. I mean, obviously there's a lot, but there's, that lowering of estrogen and that increase of the fat estrogen that our bodies make. I mean, that is something that, we really can't avoid. And so by taking ashwagandha or rhodiola to help us think better and to help us go to sleep and to help us respond to the stress that we can't avoid better,
Mm-hmm.
those can be huge helpful aids along with all the lifestyle things.
Yeah. Well, let's finish up by talking about some of those so that our listeners can definitely take away, maybe a checklist of things that they could think about in their life of implementing. And just as we're having this discussion, if there's any other questions, feel free to add them into the chat. We'll be finishing up here, but happy to address those. So when you're talking with your patients, Wendy, do you find things that come up as most common stressors, or do you have a checklist of things to go through in terms of how women can look at their life right now and find areas they might be able to reduce stress?
Yeah, I had a patient yesterday, and it was just really interesting because I feel like a lot of people are in this place where she's working full time. She's got two kids, one's in high school, one's in college. She's taking 2 classes to get her accounting, like associates in accounting. And she's like being a mom, and she's a little bit type A, so she likes to clean the house, but she's working, she comes home, she makes dinner, and then she just, will go do homework. And so she doesn't have any time for exercise. And
Mm-hmm.
she's just like, oh my gosh, I'm gaining all this weight around the middle. And I think that movement and exercise and making time for yourself is one thing that women around menopause are terrible at doing. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like we're really terrible at self-care,
Yeah.
because we don't want to drop the ball anywhere. And she also said, I feel like I'm becoming OCD, where I just like want the house perfectly clean, and like I just don't know where there's room for self-care. And she said, and then I finish my homework and I just want to sit on the couch and like have a glass of wine.
Mm-hmm.
And in the morning I get up and I just want a couple minutes, so I'm not getting any exercise. I just want to sit on the couch and like watch the news and drink my coffee. And I'm like, okay, so all these things are happening. Like if you don't move your body, it's going to be really hard to get better. Because again, yes, cortisol can rise secondary to the immediate effects of exercise, but its long-term effect is having that maintained low cortisol. So if you can lower your cortisol by exercising over the course of time, having that low cortisol, it's probably the one most impactful thing you can do. And then the other thing is diet. So a lot of people get home and they eat meals really late, and eating meals really late is not a good thing to do. And so if you can make time for exercise and you can make time to eat earlier, or have your larger meal at lunchtime and eat a smaller meal at dinner time, and try to eat at least 3 hours before you go to bed. I think those are the two really important things that we're not doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing is, you know, having some outlet for your stress, whether it be using an app like the Calm app or a Headspace app, because you don't have to go anywhere. You know,
Yeah.
you can do it anywhere you are. You can just close your eyes, put your earphones in, and just let your body relax. And they do the work for you. And
Yeah.
so those are the most important things. And then, you know, a lot of people will drink too much, you know, because we're stressed and we want to just like drink some wine at the end of the evening. And that is a big, that raises your cortisol level. And it also increases to that weight around the middle, which adds to more stress. So we're just propagating this, you know, this thing. And so I know that not having enough time is one of the biggest complaints.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't make time for exercise and self-care, you're not going to be able to take care of everything else. You know,
Yeah.
it just makes time for disease, you
Yeah.
know?
It's counterintuitive where we are in a culture that really promotes doing more and being the best at everything, and you have to show up and be the student, the mom, the worker, and that's a lot. And so it's counterintuitive to take a step back to care for yourself, to realize that that actually could get you more steps forward.
You know, I think one thing that's a little bit shocking and horrifying is looking at your phone to see how much time you've spent on your phone. And, you know, a lot of people are on their phones, like, you know, mindlessly scrolling through things. And, you know, you figure if you spend 2 or 3 hours a day looking at your phone, playing Words with Friends or on Facebook or reading Twitter or whatever people do on their phones, like if we have time for that, then we can definitely take from that. And I feel like some of the things the idle time, we could use a lot more effectively. And people say, but I'm so tired, I can't exercise. But exercise actually gives you more energy. And so,
Yes.
and again, it will lower that cortisol level. And so it's just something that, you know, I see a lot of patients over the course of their, you know, I've had some patients that I've had since 2005. And
Wow.
it's been really great because I generally start with them at menopause, and now they're in their 70s. And
Mm-hmm.
the ones that do best are the ones that move their bodies every day.
Mm.
And you can't take that in a supplement.
Yeah, no, that's one of just how our bodies are meant to move. And I like how you preface to the movement piece. It doesn't have to be structured exercise. It doesn't have to be miserable, but can you move and maybe start, if you are really fatigued, can you start with a walk around the block? See where that takes you. Maybe then you have a little bit more energy. And then if you're still fatigued, okay, maybe the next day it's two laps around the block, but you've started to move your body in that way. And that's the most important thing. You're moving forward in some way, shape, or form.
Yes, exactly. And I think the hardest part of exercise is making yourself do it.
Hmm.
Like,
Yes.
but once you're out the door, or, you know, once you put your shoes on,
Hmm.
like you're committed. And
Yeah.
I feel like, you know, my mother is a good example of, was never really, always really active, but never really an exerciser. And probably 10 or 15 years ago, started walking with her friend, like 3 miles a day. And it's just amazing because my father is in this place where he's been the opposite. He's decompensated. He watches a lot of golf. And you know, it's just really interesting to see how I used to see my parents like this. And now my mom, who's exercising, so much energy and fit and, you know, not on any medications. And my dad, you know, just isn't getting enough exercise. And I do see that high cortisol and that weight around the middle. And it just is propagated by, you know, I don't feel good. I'm tired. I don't have enough time in my day. I'm too stressed. I don't want to add one more thing.
Hmm.
Um, and so, you know, it's you have to sacrifice something somewhere.
Hmm.
And so, for me, I'm like, oh, I need to move my exercise to the morning because otherwise the day just gets swallowed up in other people's things.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
or
great
get a dog.
suggestion. Yeah, there you go. That's true too. Have to definitely have to take the dog. I have or almost 10-month-old puppy, and that dog does need to get out multiple times per
Yeah,
day, and it's not
yeah.
able to do it on its own right now.
No, and
So,
that'll add some stress. A dog that hasn't had enough exercise.
exactly. Well, we have one other question here to finish up with. Just asking about ashwagandha. Can ashwagandha, let's see, is ashwagandha safe to take if you've had ovarian cancer? And then can ashwagandha help to raise depleted DHEA levels?
Ashwagandha will not improve your DHEA level. And so I have not seen, I did take a quick look at that. And again, DHEA will increase with DHEA supplementation. But I have not seen any studies on ashwagandha increasing DHEA levels. And as far as ashwagandha, was it ovarian cancer?
Ovarian cancer.
So it should be fine. Definitely something I will check into for
Okay.
sure. And so maybe you can connect me in some way or get that person's information, and I can circle back on that.
Okay, that sounds good. We can work to connect on that piece. All right. Well, thank you so much, Wendy. Any closing thoughts on this topic? I think you hit the exercise piece pretty good, so I think that's a good closing message. But any other information you want to share with our listeners?
Yeah. Hold on. I put a couple stars next to this. Let's see. Just, if you don't raise your if you don't work on lowering your cortisol levels, it's associated with a lot of negative things, meaning it can raise your glucose levels. It can decrease your ability to heal tissues in the body. It can increase inflammation. And so there's a lot of negative side effects to having high cortisol levels. And I would say that even though adrenal fatigue is sort of the phrase that's thrown around a lot, I feel like the adrenal dysfunction really, as what I see it in practice, tends to be more high cortisol than low cortisol.
Mm-hmm.
And it's definitely associated with lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can take things to help us, but at the end of the day, we really need to get enough sleep. If you're getting hot flashes, treat those hot flashes, whether it be with herbs or botanicals. If you're eating poorly, or you're eating too late, or you're drinking too much wine in the evening, those are all behavioral things. And, obviously sleep is one of the most important things that cortisol affects. And so if you're, not sleeping well, then cortisol is one of the most important things you can look at to try to help improve your sleep. Because sleep medications, even the over-the-counter ones, they have detrimental effects on our cognitive function in the long run. And with a lot of women worried about Alzheimer's because it's so much more prevalent in women, I think it's just really important that we stop taking things to try to treat things that should be treated with behavior changes.
Okay, excellent. And Wendy, if any of our panel or participants want to get in touch with you, how would they be able to work with you?
Yeah, so I am a telemedicine provider for Gennev, and so you can make an appointment with me via Gennev, and that you can find me on the list of telemedicine providers. And if you are in the state of Washington and Oregon, I do have a private practice, and you can email me at info and at drwendyellis.com. And my website is just dr like doctor wendyellis.com, and you can always send me a message via my website as well.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today. And thank you everyone for participating, for your questions, and for listening to this topic. Just also a reminder, through Gennev, we offer our Health Fix program, and that gives you an opportunity to work with a coach like myself or our other coaches, and you're able to learn, again, more of those lifestyle things that we talked about as really being factors in terms of stress management. So what's appropriate exercise, nutrition, sleep, stress management, really, and help to have that personalized strategy for you based on your current lifestyle and your goals. And then finally, just to let you know, our next webinar will be on Monday, the 22nd of June, I believe. And that we are going to be talking with representatives from Eucora, and they are a company that has a treatment, they use treatment approaches for urinary tract infections. So we'll be talking about that as it relates to menopause. So that's coming up on Monday at 3 p.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern time. So thank you all for participating, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thanks, Stacey.